Welcome. My name is Chris Cook. I'm the president of the Mobile Electronics Association and kind of the de facto founder of Connect2Car some 23 years ago, right here at CES, when Gary Shapiro and Neil Shelkey, who was the then member president of SAE, got together and did a joint keynote. And we introduced the panel with IDB Forum, IEEE, and MOST. All three of those at that time were not in a vehicle. So think back to that when you just had basic CAN networks in a vehicle. We had the forethought to try to do this. And the reason we did it was because the OEM aftermarket suppliers weren't having the conversations. So the car was being delivered with great technology, but as soon as the car needed to be upgraded, it would go to the dealer or to an aftermarket shop, and there'd be roadblocks to putting things in. Simple things like the chime that was now in the GM vehicle for the seatbelt chime. The aftermarket had to reverse and re-engineer to put that seatbelt chime in. So just little things like that that needed communication so the customer could be satisfied with the vehicle all the way through. This presentation, all 6 of them today, are going to focus on electrifying the electrifying future of autonomous mobility. There are 6 panels throughout the day, and hopefully you'll be able to attend them all because they all kind of connect to each other. But we're really talking about the future of mobility, but really for this panel focused on the automobile. It's going to kick off this morning with Steve Greenfield, CEO of Automotive Ventures. He's got a groundbreaking presentation that made me upset, but loved it, about disruption. And then our second panel at 10 o'clock will be Nat, Zib, Lewis, and Matt. You'll get to know all of them. We had Madison White in. Madison White wasn't able to attend at the last minute, so one of our colleagues, Matt Jones, was able to step in. Thank you, Matt. And that's the anatomy of autonomy, so we talk about autonomous vehicles. Next up, I'll be moderating one called Electrifying the Future with Matt, Chris, Trevor, and Adam, all folks I had dinner with last night, and we struck up some good conversations, and you should be able to share in those as well. Going to the Gemba, Mr. John Warniak, who's the dressed appropriate guy in the room. He's the only one not wearing a suit, thank you. I need to model after him. Courtney from Panasonic will be joining us, Robert from Clemson, and Paul Mitchell, the president of the Indy Autonomous Challenge, which is Saturday, John? Yeah, Saturday. And then I'm stepping in to do the Digital Disruptors, which is a fun one. Guru is stuck in San Francisco, so he's not going to make the panel, so we will have Monica, Maya, and Joe, and we're going to be talking about the disruptions in the industry, good and bad, for electrifying and autonomous. And then finally, Steve Greenfield will finish it up with a couple of great panelists looking at kind of the changing the channel, and this is about changing the channel of the way vehicles are delivered. So if you look, Amari and McKinsey will be here, Mac, and we look forward to hearing what they have to say. It ought to be an interesting conversation. So right now, let's get started with Connect2Car. And Mr. Greenfield, if you join me here on the podium, I'll let you jump in. And guys, if you want to go ahead and switch to that other presentation. Back. Mr. Steve Greenfield, thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.
Kill him.
Appreciate it. I'll do my best. So we've got 40 minutes this morning. Thanks for joining me. I get to kick off this morning. One thing I will mention, if we can switch over to, here we go. At least I haven't started my timer yet.
Tried my best not to cut any time.
That's all right. Whenever you're ready, you can switch over to my presentation, the PDF. There we go. All right, thanks. Okay, everyone. I will provide this presentation to anybody who wants it. My email is steve@automotiveventures.com. I also have a slide up at the end with my contact information. You can find me on LinkedIn. If you want a copy of the presentation, happy to take photos of the slides if you want, but I can immediately, as I get off stage, send you a copy of the presentation as well. So my journey has been about 23 years now in automotive. Started off working in Toronto, so you'll get hints of the accent still, despite the fact me being down in the south for about 20 years now. And did 10 years in a big B2B marketplace, automotive marketplace called Manheim. Then 10 years in, went over to a consumer-facing marketplace owned by the same company, AutoTrader. Spent a couple of years overseeing acquisitions there, and then worked for a publicly traded competitor to AutoTrader called 2Car, similar role, overseeing strategy and acquisitions for a public company before leaving the corporate world just at the beginning of COVID, and now I find myself at this point in my career a venture capitalist, investing in early stage mobility and automotive technology companies. So I do maintain a monthly newsletter that is free that you can subscribe to at automotiveventures.com that attempts to track this ecosystem, this ever-growing ecosystem of vendors, many of whom are here this week, and categorize them, and specifically, self-servingly, keep track of those interesting ones that are very early stage so we can make investments in them, but do try to make sense of these various categories. And I have a book. I think I left my book there. Chris, if you mind handing me a copy of the book. This was my one prop I had today that I forgot. So thank you. So I've got a book also, and happy to send a copy of this to anyone. You can get it on Amazon. It's called The Future of Automotive Retail. It came out in July this year to try to provide a perspective of the next 5 to 10 years in automotive. And we're currently working on the second book, which is going to be titled The Future of Mobility, and you'll get a little bit of a glimpse of that today. And the last thing I'll mention is I do also track all of the publicly traded mobility companies in the world. And yes, Tesla's market cap is all proportional market capitalization for the public companies. Tesla's market cap since the end of November, when this slide was built, is down considerably. With all due respect to Tesla, things have shifted quite a bit since then. But it's interesting to be able to juxtapose the private markets where we invest with the public market shares as well. And some of the categories, autonomy and electrification specifically, given many of those companies went public over the last couple of years via SPACs, are down substantially, some trading at less than the cash that they've got on the balance sheet because they are burning cash. So let's start. My clock hasn't started up here, but if you want to start me whenever, please do, just so I have a reminder of how much time I have. So this is what I'm going to try to sell to you today, right? Probably with the folks in this audience, you know this better than I do. Walking around CES, you'll get a sense now. Automotive is quickly taking over this conference, but we are seeing this accelerating pace of change. You're going to hear that from all of our panelists and speakers today in this room, and it's not too hard to believe that we are going to see more change in the next 5 to 10 years than we've seen in this industry in the last 100. So, you know, whatever metaphor you want to use, strap in, put your seatbelt on, grab your surfboard. We've got a lot of change, which for me is exhilarating and exciting, having been in the industry for so long to see this. But for a lot of people, this creates a lot of anxiety, as Chris said earlier. And you know, some of the slides that I present today may create anxiety depending on where you are in the ecosystem and what your business is. The changes coming to automotive are not only limited to these areas, but a lot of it is being driven by consumer expectations that are being set in categories outside of automotive. I typically spend quite a bit of time in presentations like this talking about decomposing sort of Amazon's model and how they've started with selling books online, but now have expanded into many different categories, not the least of which is a very large and growing automotive practice as well. But we'll spend time today specifically thematically talking about the connected vehicle and what impact that may have. And the interesting thing about connected vehicles is, you know, there are all these different use cases, right? Once you can collect data in real time off of sensors on the vehicle, you can apply that data to many different use cases, be it vehicles communicating to one another, the vehicle communicating back to the actual city itself to influence things like street lights and traffic flow within the city. And then, not the least of which, on the right-hand side, and you'll be seeing a lot of evidence that today as you walk around CES, is electrification and getting data off the vehicle to influence where we install chargers, charger availability, allowing the vehicles to anticipate where they need to be charged and where we need to make infrastructure investments around charging based on vehicle activity and the data that we're able to pull off vehicles on the road. This slide's years dated, but the data is relevant. At this point, almost every vehicle that is produced, new vehicle, is, and I'll use air quotes intentionally, connected. Doesn't mean that it's pulling data off of a number of different sensors on that vehicle, and or that data coming off those sensors is being transmitted in real time back to the interested party, be that the consumer on an application, be it to the manufacturer, be it to a parts supplier, or be it to the dealer that sold the vehicle. But almost every vehicle today enables connectivity. The interesting stat in the left-hand corner is that not every vehicle that's in operation, and I'll reference the U.S. market, and I apologize for those internationals that are in. But in the U.S., there's about 330 million passenger vehicles on the road. Not all of them are connected, but then there's a subsegment that have the latent ability to be connected, but their connectivity is not activated. So we need to reconcile those things as well. But for all intents and purposes, you can think of when a new vehicle is produced today, it is connected. It doesn't necessarily have the sensors that are active, especially as that vehicle becomes aged and used. So what are some of the more interesting use cases around vehicle data? So I'm going to run through these quickly, but again, we'll give you the slides. I don't have a lot of time today to dig in. But some of the more interesting ones that I plucked out that wanted to highlight are, for example, fuel economy and emissions reduction. Infrastructure optimization, as I mentioned earlier. For a vehicle, an electric vehicle, to be able to kind of sense what the usage is of that vehicle and where we need to invest more charger infrastructure and or make sure that the chargers that we have 100% uptime and availability. In-field testing, so we'll talk a little bit about that today, but very interesting now that as the manufacturers and the parts suppliers can get feedback from the vehicles in real time, now we can start to measure which features and which options are used on the vehicles to influence the breakage rate of these critical components, as well as the usage rate to see that where I live in Atlanta, if I'm not using heated seats, it may be a feature that doesn't need to be installed in the future, and OEMs can reduce their costs as a result and influence what they're building. And then there's software updates as well, which we'll talk about today, and then warranty costs as well that we'll talk about today. If you look at telematics specifically, there are three categories of use cases, really vehicle analytics themselves, which includes vehicle health management and fraud detection or cybersecurity. There's driver analytics, which is actually analyzing the driver's use of the vehicle. This includes driver behavior monitoring, collision detection analysis, and navigation location monitoring. And the third is operations management, which is more if you own fleets, fleet monitoring and control, transport management, and fleet utilization rates as well. All of which get tucked into connected vehicles, and without the connectivity of vehicles, we could never collect the data to be able to enable these use cases. So three areas of the book that I'm going to explore today, and again, we'll get you these slides so you can dig in deeper, and happy to have a conversation after. The first being electrification. And it'll be very interesting, again, to walk around and look at the proportion of the manufacturer's footprint that's dedicated to talking about EVs and EV innovation. In the US, and this is much higher in China and much higher in Europe, just to kind of contrast, but being US-centric here, where we are in Vegas, we exited the year last year at about 10% of passenger vehicles being plug-in electrics, the combination of plug-in battery electrics as well as plug-in hybrids. And the question will be, how quickly will that percentage grow? Again, if you look at the European market, especially specific countries within the European market, in the Nordics, huge penetration. But this is information from S&P Global as of November, so 2 months ago now, that looks at about 2030 to 2032 as being the tipping point when we'll be selling new plug-in battery vehicles than internal combustion engine vehicles for the US market. Again, keep in mind, there are 330 million vehicles in operation. So in terms of the addressable market of vehicles, it's going to take quite a bit longer for a lag to get to half of the vehicles in operation being plug-in battery. But the forecast is about 50% by 2030, which is now only like 7 years away. But we face resistance, right? And the U.S. may be unique somewhat in this resistance, but as I think of the resistance towards the electrification of the vehicles in operation, I think of sort of cost aside, right? Because hopefully the cost of batteries will come down over time, although that hasn't played out over the last year. I kind of think of the triangle of range, so how far we can get out of one battery, to the availability of charging infrastructure and whether it's online. Are really the three areas. So can I get charging infrastructure? Is it going to be available? And what is the range of the vehicle? These things are resistors, especially in a country that's as massive as the U.S., that has longer driving distances typically, especially out of dense urban areas. And this isn't slowing down from the automakers, many of whom are represented maybe in this room today and definitely out on the show floor, from these proclamations that they're going 100% electric. And I have a hard time juxtaposing the realities of there'll be certain consumers in the US where an EV just won't be a good fit for them, for their lifestyle and driving behaviors, with many of the manufacturers proclaiming they're going 100% EV. And I think this can be summarized with as a CEO of a public company, I feel immense kind of empathy because there are tensions, right? There are tensions to manage the stock price, manage the dealer network, manage obviously consumer expectations, the supply chain, et cetera. And then also the huge amount of money that's being spent by OEMs on creating this software-defined vehicle, and the money being spent to build out a competency in software, which we see much evidence of here at CES, as well as the competency in retooling all of my factories to go from my historical competency in internal combustion engines to EVs all at the same time. So we are about to test what natural consumer demand is in the US for EVs. This is an article in October, 3 months ago, in Automotive News. It says there's about 150 new EVs that are going to hit the market in the US through 2026. So whatever we believe, hypothesize the demand is going to be, we're going to test, and we'll see what natural demand is. I think probably about 25 to 30% of passenger vehicles right now there's demand for, and as we overproduce that amount, I think we will see a surplus of EVs. Not every single one of these 150 EVs is going to be a home run. We see great EVs out on the floor today, but they will be trying to fill every nook and cranny of demand across every single permutation of type of EV, and we're going to get oversupplied, right? So there'll be a lot of supply of certain EVs, incentives will come back, these will build up on dealership lots, and a lot of them will be vented into commercial fleets. The other thing to notice here before we move on from EVs is the service intervals and complexity of an EV versus a comparable ICE vehicle is much less. Many fewer moving parts, as I'll talk about in a few slides. There aren't the regular service needs for oil changes, for spark plugs, et cetera. And so as we penetrate more EVs, the folks that service these vehicles, regular service, automotive service, are going to definitely feel immediately the fact that these consumers aren't going to be coming back in as frequently. So let's switch to number 2, connectivity, one of the more interesting areas. So whether you love or hate this guy, and there's an interesting case study playing out right now with his ownership of Twitter, but I mean, he's a very polarizing, maybe the most polarizing individual on the face of the earth right now. Interestingly enough, because Tesla has been so software-centric over time, we get leading indicators, right, of how the legacy manufacturers are looking at Tesla and saying, oh, what can we learn from Tesla? This is an interesting article that I pulled out from a year and a half ago, where Tesla pronounced that on Model 3s and Model Ys, they were going to lose the adjustable lumbar support for the passenger seat. And they made this decision based on the fact that 97% of the cars weren't ever touching that button and making that adjustment. So think of this as an illustrative example. Now an automaker or a tier 1 supplier can look and say, let's actually collect real-time data from the vehicles that are out there in the wild being used and figure out how often are heated seats used in Boston versus Atlanta. How often is someone in the back adjusting the seats, et cetera? And then they can make decisions around the supply chain to say there are certain features that just never get used. And we'll in a few slides, we'll get to the point around unbundling these features into monthly subscriptions, which always gets people's antenna up. But it is interesting. We have a new world now as most, if not all, cars are connected and are going to be permeated with sensors. We will be able to tell in real time which features are and are not being used, which will influence the vehicle production cycles and accelerate those cycles. Mary Barra from GM has sort of said at an investor conference a year ago, start to think of us as a device maker, and more interestingly than making profit on the device itself, we'll be making profit on the software solutions that we sell to consumers post-purchase, right? Much like an iPhone. And this was very, very well received news from Wall Street, and as a result, many of the other legacy OEMs have announced similar announcements. And we see huge spending as a result from manufacturers being announced to build out a competency. Again, chasing the Tesla ideal image of being a software-first company. Because if the OEMs don't either partner with a software provider or own this competency in-house, they're never going to live up to this dream of unlocking all of these billions of dollars in additional subscription services and all the over-the-air update competency that I'm about to talk about. And then in parallel, the OEMs are spending, in this case, $1 trillion aggregated together, but each spending tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars on the to electrification. So the challenge is for an OEM, I'm trying to do these two things at the same time. Retool my factory. One, figure out the timing when it's appropriate to retool my factories to go from ICE to EV. It would be easy if everybody just binarily said, we're making the hard switch over. We're not going to try to run two different types of supply chains, right? One for ICE, one for EVs simultaneously, and figure out how quickly or how slowly we're going to switch over from ICE to EV. But at the same time, spend tens of billions of dollars redefining themselves as software companies. And legacy OEMs have never done very well with software. I'm usually a consumer of German luxury vehicles. I can tell you that the nav systems for 10 years have sucked, and no offense to anybody in this room, I won't call out names, but the nav systems on these German vehicles, you think they would have figured it out. And I'm sure they spend a lot of money on the actual software itself, but I think consumers default over to using their phone. I just, sync my phone and use Waze, and it works out well. And I think that's the challenge right now. How is an OEM going to spend billions of dollars to build a software competency when you've got pure tech players out there, a la Apple and Google, who are also craving the ability to own the dash space at the same time? So again, to the actual connected vehicles, the OEMs are all talking about tens to 20s of billions of dollars recurring per year of new subscription services. So GM said at that same investor conference a year ago, they're expecting to make $25 billion in new revenue by 2030, all of which, by the way, when you push a software update to a vehicle and unlock a feature that's already built into the car, there isn't really any cost of goods sold to deliver that. The gross margins are almost 100%. So this is all very, very attractive revenue to a legacy OEM if they can get ahead of this and actually build that software. GM said that $6 billion of that 25 billion will be through usage-based insurance off of the vehicles itself. We saw Stellantis follow suit and talk about over $20 billion a year in new revenue from software, and the same from Ford, over $20 billion a year in software. So when you add this all up, there's a lot of money that will be extracted on a monthly basis from all of us as we drive vehicles around and pay on a monthly subscription basis to have a lot of features unlocked on our vehicles. BMW announced in South Korea here, last summer that they were going to give folks the option of either upfront buying rear heated seats or paying on a monthly basis, and there was a lot of backlash, right? This is one of the most inflammatory things that I hear from audiences today as I present on these subscription services. People just find it like repulsive that the car is going to have features built in that won't be unlocked at the point of purchase, but the consumer later on will be able to unlock on a monthly basis. And looking around this room, it doesn't look like there's a ton of millennials in this audience, but I think, and I make the argument frequently, we've conditioned a younger generation to pay for almost everything on a monthly basis and have that convenience. So while we may have this visceral reaction to say, that's horrible, it could never be done, et cetera, I do think, with a new generation of shoppers, they'll be conditioned to say, look, I only want to pay for heated seats or all-wheel drive or more horsepower during those months where I'm going to use it. If I'm not going to use it, I can turn it off and save money. That seems like a good value prop to a consumer, but it is interesting because right now there's a lot of tension around this. Mercedes and actually Polestar as well has said that there'll be performance enhancements that you can pay on a monthly basis to unlock additional horsepower on these EVs and get better acceleration. So this is all coming very, very quickly, and we'll see what consumer receptivity is to this. What we don't know is how these revenues that will get unlocked, these billions of dollars of revenues, will be shared between the manufacturer and the dealers. That's causing anxiety as well, right? Because if I'm a dealer and I sell a consumer a vehicle, and then 6 months later they opt to unlock 50 or 100 horsepower on a monthly basis, that dealer may not even be aware that the consumer has unlocked that feature. Never mind sort of if any of that revenue will be shared back with that dealer. So these tensions are playing out real time with dealer councils negotiating with manufacturers. And I think that we'll be hearing more of that as well over time. And then the other question is, when the car gets traded in at the end of 3 or 4 years, do all of those subscribed products go back to a base model? And then the next buyer, who's responsible for trying to upsell them all of the features that were active yesterday but are no longer active today because the person whose credit card was being hit just turned the car in and wants to deactivate all these things. So I think there'll be innovation to prove to the consumer, hey, we've deactivated everything on your car, you'll no longer be charged. But then there'll be other solutions that need to come out to try to sell you when you buy a used car, hey, these are all the permutations of things you could activate, and here's what we recommend, and you can slide your credit card and pay for these things on a monthly basis. And of course, we've seen the first indication that there will be lawsuits, in this case New Jersey, who's pushing back, and it's something to the tune of, if the features are built into the car and there isn't any additional cost incurred with activating those features, then it should be illegal. And we don't know how this is going to play out. I mean, again, evidence that this does cause this negative visceral reaction from folks. I assume that we'll see other state lawsuits. I don't know if there'll be any merit. I'm not a lawyer, but we'll see more evidence of this too play out over the next year, which will be really interesting. Okay, so last, servicing of vehicles we want to talk about, and relatedly. So I'll use Tesla again simply because they've invested so much in the software and the software experience for consumers. So if you remember, 5 years ago, when Tesla launched the Model 3, Consumer Reports tested the vehicle and gave it a really bad grade and said, this car's braking is horrible. It brakes worse than a Ford F-150. And Elon Musk, in typical fashion, gets on Twitter and is like, Consumer Reports. And but 3-4 days later, he reaches back out to Consumer Reports and asks them, would you mind retesting the car? And they're like, we never retest vehicles. We're very scientific. If anybody from Consumer Reports is in the room today, very scientific. I mean, we can assure you that if we retest the same vehicle, we'll get exactly the same results. Well, they retested the same vehicle and found that the braking distance from 60 miles an hour to 0 was reduced by 20 feet. And suddenly, a car that was not competitive in its class suddenly was very competitive in its class. And no technician touched this vehicle. This is all done through a software update that was pushed via Wi-Fi to this test vehicle. And this incident 5 years ago really opened the eyes, and I guess opened the Pandora's box of what else could we do if we can change the driving dynamics of a vehicle without ever touching the vehicle. We need to start investing in software and follow this path because it enables all kinds of new functionality and is mind expanding for the legacy manufacturers. So let's talk about over-the-air updates. So some of those benefits to the manufacturers are And I know Cliff Banks is in here, so Cliff, thank you for this data. This is from a consulting firm a few years ago, ABI Research, that showed that for the domestic manufacturers in the US, they were doing about $18 billion a year in annual warranty work. And with over-the-air updates, about a third of that will go away entirely. You'll be able to make updates that otherwise were done at the dealership in the consumer's driveway overnight via Wi-Fi software update. This is all revenue that would have gotten reimbursed to dealers that will evaporate and go away entirely. Incredibly strong consumer value prop. I don't have to bring my car in anymore for warranty work, but this does change the revenue and profitability for dealerships. Another consulting firm, IHS Markit, shows that the OEMs collectively, their cost savings from over-the-air update pushes to vehicles are going to, by 2025, be $60 billion. These are billions of dollars. $60 billion collectively, because this is cost avoidance where they don't have to actually have either recalls or warranty work coming back into the dealership and reimburse the dealer. They can simply have software pushes that will update the software in these vehicles. As I said earlier, the number of moving components in the drivetrain for an EV are significantly less than the ICE vehicle. So forget for a second the fact that we don't need to bring vehicles back in for oil changes and spark plugs. There's not a lot to fail. Failure can be catastrophically expensive if the battery cells go, but the actual juxtaposing of the actual moving parts within an EV versus an ICE vehicle is significantly less. And McKinsey has said over the lifetime of an EV, that vehicle will need about 40% less parts. And the manufacturers have very healthy wholesale parts divisions, right, that generate a lot of profit. But the manufacturers are going to feel this, and the dealers are going to feel this. They're just going to be selling fewer parts as we move over from ICE vehicles to EVs. And Jose Munoz from Hyundai has said a good rule of thumb that he uses is the electric vehicle is going to require about 1/3 of the service of the internal combustion engine vehicle. Again, great value prop, a little bit anxiety provoking for dealerships and anybody who's producing parts for vehicles. So let's talk about service defection. So this is data from one of our portfolio companies called WarCloud. But at the end of the warranty period, in the US at least, there's about a 70% defection rate, right? Consumers are very loyal to their franchise dealer, either the one they bought the vehicle from or within the same brand, during the life of the warranty. But at the end of the warranty, consumers in the US tend to defect. They start to go to independent repair shops to have the vehicle serviced. And let's talk a little bit about this dynamic, because I think this is going to change and flatten out as the cars become more complex. The dealers have specialized technicians that can work on these vehicles and are making significant investments in special tooling to be able to work on these vehicles. So, because while the cars are becoming less complex in some ways from the number of moving parts, the actual technology in the vehicles is going to make it increasingly hard for anybody in the aftermarket to be able to touch and work on these vehicles. This is an article out of Wired magazine last year making the argument that the technology advancements in these vehicles is really making it very hard to have a technician at an independent repair shop that can possibly have the competency for every single different brand as they become more complex. And then we should spend a little time on these right to repair bills, right? So we've had one that's still being contested up in Massachusetts, which basically makes the argument that, hey, we're going to kill the independent repair. As Chris said earlier on stage, whatever that was 10 years ago, same sort of argument, right? If we lock down the vehicle and don't let anyone else touch it but the franchise dealership network, it's going to have cascading effects across many of the vendors who are in the room today, many who are here at CES. And it's just not fair because the consumer should be able to have the right on their vehicle once they own it to be able to shop and have work done on the vehicle wherever they like. The tension here is going to be the cars are complex, and many more of the repairs, as I've said, are going to be data-driven, software updates as opposed to physically turning wrenches on vehicles. And the argument with these right to repair acts is the OEMs need to be able to provide the data off the vehicles in an open fashion, an open API, to anyone who wants access to it. which is great theoretically, but in practice, it's going to be very, very complex and hard to be able to work on every single permutation of these vehicles as the vehicles themselves become more complex. And we saw recently that GM and Stellantis, as of October, said that they can't comply with these right to repair acts, right? I mean, you can bite your cheek and say, why might this be? They say it's just going to be too complex to be able to do. And by the way, usually these arguments from the OEMs are made under the guise of cybersecurity. Hey, if we open up the architecture and open up anyone to have access to this thing, how do we ensure the integrity of the vehicles from a cybersecurity standpoint? So I've got 4 minutes left, so let me wrap. So what now? So I think of all the themes that we talked about today, I think that the ones that impact this audience most are these, right? We need to keep an eye on consumer expectations, and maybe a better word is receptivity, right? Because will consumers buy subscription services? Will consumers be turned on by avoiding bringing their vehicles in for service, et cetera? We didn't talk at all today about the purchase of vehicles, but also there is this movement towards digitization of the purchase experience as well. We talked about electric vehicles and servicing of vehicles. We didn't talk much on consumer privacy today, but as I just said, I mean, consumer privacy is going to come to the forefront because there's going to be more like sort of digital surface area on these vehicles that can get penetrated. And especially with right to repair acts, the OEMs are going to want to really protect these vehicles from anyone intruding. But the Right to Repair Act is asking them to open up and make more of a penetrable surface on these vehicles from a data standpoint. We talked about connectivity and over-the-air and software subscriptions. So what do you do? I mean, I know we have a very diverse sort of like number of businesses in here out of different categories. Here would be my practical advice, not without going into each of your businesses. And something that we do, we eat the same dog food here for our investment fund. I think it's very important to apply what is a very typical risk matrix, right, to your business and look at these threats, these opportunities from a probability versus consequence. Because things that are low probability, you don't have to worry about, and things that have a high probability but a low significance to you, you don't have to worry about as well. It's really stuff that migrates over to the right, upper right-hand quadrant, which is if some of these themes you feel and your management team feels is very probable and happening and has a significant impact on your business, those are the ones that you should be paying attention to and building your strategy around. So as you walk around CES, you're going to see a lot of new technologies, but using a simple 2x2 framework like this can help you map these out to make sure that you're paying attention to the ones that are most probable and have the most potential impact on your business. For us, we've done this with the 18 or 20 themes that impact us across the automotive and mobility spectrum to make sure that, as we look at the customers of these themes, we anticipate what the probability and magnitude of the consequences are, so we can invest our time and intellect into pursuing those that probably are going to manifest as having the biggest impact on the industry. And as I said, we put our money where our mouth is. Literally, we are investing now out of 2 funds and trying to build our thesis around mobility and automotive technology based on all of these trends in the industry. So applying a lot of the same 2x2 risk matrix to the themes, and then distilling the themes down to investment areas, and then trying to find investments within certain categories. One company in particular that we invested in is Privacy for Cars, which simply makes sure that at the end of your rental or end of your lease, any data that you've synchronized from your phone to the vehicle is wiped off the vehicle. And you may laugh, but I mean, I would challenge you this: if you go rent a car, the next time you rent a car, go look at the screen and see how many other phones have been synced to that car that haven't been cleaned. And in many cases, the contacts as well are on that car. I have a good example. I've got one of our investors has a BMW store, and he takes home the hot trade-ins when they get a hot trade-in. So he got a BMW M8 and realized quickly that not only did the previous owner's address was on there and all of the person's contacts, but the garage door opener was still synced to the guy's garage. This is very typical. You might nod or you might moan or whatever, but for one practical piece of advice for all of you is make sure that if you rent a car or you bring your car at the end of the lease, wipe your stuff off the car, because that guy literally could have driven to that guy's house and opened the garage. And who knows who's going to own that car in the future?
Take five.
Five? Well, I don't have five, but...
Just in case.
All right, so you want me to slow down my talking?
Just in case.
Well, maybe we'll take a couple questions. All right, so so how to get involved with us? Second last slide, although Chris says I have 5 minutes. So I would ask you to subscribe to our weekly and monthly Intel report. Much of this content I publish on a monthly basis and spend a lot of time publishing. So that is free. If you're interested in getting exposure to our early stage companies, we are at this point seeing about 60 companies per month, all seed stage, some pre-revenue, some early stage revenue. But if you're interested in actually making investments yourself, we just set up an investment club where we'll be exposing our early stage companies to folks like you that have an interest in investing. And that you can join for free and just see our companies. And if you ever want to kind of like pick one that you want to invest in, great, you can participate with us. And then lastly, the heavier lift is we do have 2 funds now. Be happy to talk to you about investing in our core funds and let the heavy lifting around figuring out what to invest in. So with that, if I've got a couple minutes.
Yeah, take it.
All right, I got a couple minutes. Questions? Yes?
Yeah, I got one.
I'll just repeat so everybody can hear, so go ahead.
Great presentation, by the way. Could you comment a little bit on the OTA connectivity pushes to the car and the relationship with the wireless carriers, including cost?
I don't know about the wireless carriers and cost. So the question was about the OTA updates, specifically around the wireless carriers and the costs. I don't know anything about that, but there may be other people in the audience that can find this guy here to talk about that. Right in the front, in the third row, right here in the front. Yes.
In the future, I know you mentioned that dealers will have a cut on software updates, but if everything is going to be done by the OEM, so where's the money? Where can the dealers used to do money on the car,
Yeah.
on the parts, on the service?
Yeah.
Now all this is disappearing.
Right.
So what's the future of dealers and distributors in the future?
Yeah. So really good questions. The question is, one two-part question. One is, why would the manufacturers, I'm going to put words in your mouth, so sorry. Why would the manufacturers share anything back with the dealers if they're the ones that built the vehicle and they're the ones that have built this new software that unlocks features on the vehicles? And I think that's a great question. I don't know what the answer is. I know right now there are many dealer councils negotiating this with the manufacturers. These conversations are going on now because the dealers are asking the same question. You know, we sell the car, we support the car after. We don't want to be cut out entirely from that revenue stream. The bigger question is, the second part of his question is, what role will the dealers play in the future if service is going to start to get negatively impacted? And by the way, pre-COVID, service and parts was more than 50% of a dealer's profitability in the US. So what role, I just think that the dealers need to embrace new technology and be open-minded. I think the dealers will play a role in subscription services on vehicles. And by the way, they may get dividend checks every month from the manufacturers. It's all pure margin. So that may offset. I think the manufacturers realize they need the dealer network because they need some place for the consumers to pick up the vehicles and get the vehicles serviced. But I do believe, to your point, the economic sharing is going to change pretty dramatically over the next few years. That's right, yeah. Good? All right, well, thank you very much. You can get me on town.